final batter this morning, so to speak, is Hans Reinders. Comes from the Netherlands. Has been he and John were the stalwarts of this at the very beginning. In many ways at the Summer Institute, because some of you may not know this, but others do, that this first Summer Institute I helped plan and then couldn't go to because of a major clinical depression. And John and Hans pulled that through with the help of Eric and others. So Tom Reynolds and I share some journeys, no doubt that some of the rest of you all share as well, and ones we're quite willing to talk about. But Hans has written profoundly and eloquently in philosophy, ethics, theology, and speaks eloquently in those both to the worlds of theology and to the worlds of intellectual and developmental disabilities, where he's known well there as well. But today it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Hans Reinders, novelist, and his book, A Second Calling, which is, I'll let him tell you what it's about, but we've got plenty of copies of it, and it's well worth a read, and it's essentially about what it takes and who the people are who form something like a large community at the beginning. And Hans, come speak to us.
Good morning. Of course, Bill didn't tell me that I was allowed to talk about my novel, which I might do perhaps another time. Over the years, I've been very grateful to my friend John Swinton that he has never been mad with me about being so slow in responding to emails. But today, I'm even more grateful that he finally figured out why that is. I'm just a sabbatical kind of guy. A few people here have pointed out that it turned out that what they were saying was nicely arranged and it related to other people's talks without being in communication about it. It turns out that the faculty of the Summer Institute do not need to communicate about what they want to say, and even though know what needs to be said. So what I will do is basically wrap up much as what have been said by, particularly at the end of my speech, by putting a final twist to it, I hope. The contributions I have made to previous occasions, earlier versions of the Summer Institute, were sometimes quite theological, densely theological. I remember, for example, a talk on the why question in Toronto, in which I even discussed Calvin's doctrine of providence. Well, I think I remember I didn't get very high notes from the audience of that talk, but that, of course, was because I made the mistake of thinking that you can talk anywhere in the world about Calvin's doctrine of providence, and it would have been the topic, of course, to talk about here today in Holland, Michigan, because presumably it would not have fallen on deaf ears for here people at Hope College. But it happens that I've been assigned a very different question, namely to speak on the question, what is a good life? A bit broader on quality of life and human flourishing. And what I have to say about it won't not even be close to being theologically articulate. And there is a reason for that, and that has to do with the nature of the question. What it is to lead a good life. And so I will start with talking a little bit about that question itself. What kind of a question is it? And what is a convincing way of answering it? And in looking at these points, I will review some of the scientific and philosophical literature, and in a way I sort of make the circle round, because in a way I will start where Eric this morning started, by some of the research that relates to issues of quality of life and the good life. And I want to start with a debate on the question of the good life that has been carried out between scholars from within the disability field, and on the one hand, and scholars from the field of bioethics on the other hand. The scholars from the disability field have maintained that the convincing account of what it is to lead a good life must be viable for all human beings, regardless of their individual abilities or disabilities. In other words, a true account of what it is to lead a good life is a truly universal account. With this claim, they have objected to an approach that has often been taken by bioethicists who have argued that certain impairing conditions are incompatible with a good life, and examples that you see passing in this literature are not only of the nature of cognitive impairments, but also irreversibly deteriorating chronic illnesses like, for example, Duchenne's muscular disease. Against this view taken in the field of bioethics, at least by some people, disability scholars have objected that a convincing account cannot rule out in principle particular groups of people. For example, the people with Duchenne's disease and people with severe intellectual and developmental disabilities. They cannot be so ruled out irrespective of how their lives are actually lived, and this is an important point. So if one takes the position that a condition of severe cognitive impairment as such is incompatible with a good life, it's apparently of no significance how lives are actually lived for the question of whether they got good life. And I want to join disability study scholars in this, because in much of my, not in all of my previous work, I have supported their critique and argue that whatever we want to say about the question of the good life must hold true for all people, regardless of the state or conditions of their bodies and minds. In other words, I too have maintained that the conception of a good life for human being must be truly universal in order to be acceptable. And think in this connection, here's my first point of wrapping up. Think about in this connection about the way Eric criticized the focus on special needs as distinct from and opposed to universal needs. That's making exactly the same point. So, having said that, now how are we going to argue for a particular understanding of the good life that we think makes sense? And that is so the how are we going to argue is a much debated point in our society, because many people tend to think about it as a private question, in the sense that whatever the answer is, it's for individual people to decide for themselves what is a good life. There is, in other words, a tendency towards subjectivism that already a long time ago the philosopher Alistair McIntyre characterized as the privatization of the good. Issues of the good life are taken as private issues. If so, the question of what it is to lead a good life doesn't seem to sit well with taking a theological perspective to reflect upon it. Of course, it's very well possible to say what a good life is like from my particular religious perspective, but not much follows from my answer with regard to other people. They might have their own view on the matter, and if so, there is not much more to say, presumably. So this subjectivist understanding is, of course, also guiding the bioethical approach that I laid out above, in the sense that when people consider living a life with a disability as being appalling, there is no objective ground to contradict them. And hence, the wide-ranging arguments in bioethics in favor of people's rights to make their own decisions on major life issues. So there is a strong connection between that approach in bioethics and subjectivism that I pointed out. Again, subjectivism, next section. There is in the scientific literature on disability a way that has opposed the subjectivist understanding of the good life by challenging it in research on the concept of quality of life. The research has shown that when you ask people in various parts of the world what makes their life good, it turns out that their answers, there are large similarities and overlapping notions between what they say. And the research has resulted in a concept of quality of life, according to which quality of life is composed of people's performance in various domains, such as, for example, physical well-being, emotional and spiritual well-being, relationships, social participation, material possessions, education, individual rights, and so on. So much less than that people have their own individual understanding of what it is to lead a good life, they actually share a wide range of concerns that are important to them in this respect. So one way to answer the question then, the question of what it is to lead a good life, is to use the various life domains of quality of life as parameters. To lead a good life, in other words, is to do well in the domain of physical well-being, emotional well-being, relationships, etc., etc. But there is, of course, a remaining problem here. Namely, if one say to lead a good life is to do well in these and these and these domains, the question is, how well is well? Is there a standard against which people's performance can be measured? And unfortunately, the scientific literature is strongly divided on this point. According to some, we should use an average performance in the general population as a standard. Thus, for example, a person with a disability has a good life when she scores about the same in various life domains as the average American citizen does. This view has, of course, been inspired by a strong awareness of the social and political inequality for people with disabilities, such that their research was meant to challenge public authorities in creating equal opportunities for people with disabilities by comparing their conditions of life with those in the general population. But over the years, this approach has received strong criticisms. For example, by people asking why the performance of the average citizen should be normative for other people. What if people with disabilities underperform in view of the social norm, but are nonetheless perfectly happy with their lives, as often seems to be the case? And therefore the question, it seems to me, is a compelling one. But to go that direction means inevitably that the subjectivist view of quality of life is reintroduced. That's one thing. Another problem with the social norm approach for quality of life is that over the years it has clearly been hijacked by healthcare and welfare authorities who use quality of life measurements to allocate money to services and programs. And so what was developed as an instrument to enhance the social position of people with disabilities and their families came to be a tool in the hands of overseeing bureaucracies to control budgets. Now, in the eyes of many, this development means that the scientific approach trying to get away from subjectivism in understanding the good life somehow has been corrupted. It has become a political tool rather than an emancipatory tool, so to speak. But it doesn't follow, and this is the important point that I want to make, it doesn't follow that we need to go back to the subjectivist view. That tendency exists in our society and it is quite strong. For example, something that you all may know, the notion of person-centered planning in disability services can easily be seen as just another instance of this. It is an approach to having a good life that is guided by the inspiration and the dreams of the individual person, which implies the view that a life is good when the person whose life it is says so. And as such, it represents a subjectivist approach. The problem with the subjectivist approach is known in the literature as the disability paradox. It has been described quite frequently. People with disabilities, this is the disability paradox. People with disabilities are quite satisfied with the life they are living, even when from a more objective point of view, they seem to have very little reason to be so. This is particularly known to be true for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They are often much more content with their lives than people who are actually much better off. But if we would accept the subjectivist view as final, the result would be all right. But I would not necessarily agree, and I don't think I'm the only one. Now, to see how we can move forward, I want to suggest that we make a distinction between two aspects of understanding the good life, understanding quality of life. What I have discussed above as tools for measurement of quality of life looks at it as a product. This is what in current practices and policies most agencies and authorities do. They want to know what the outcomes of services and programs are for the quality of life of their clients and citizens. And in my own country, for example, we are now currently facing the increasing power of healthcare insurers that press service providers to be more effective in producing good outcomes for their customers by hammering on outcomes, outcomes, and again outcomes. The implicit message, this is an important thing, the implicit message seems to be that one is not a bit interested in how these outcomes are actually achieved. That's for professional service agencies to figure out. If they want to be paid, they need outcomes, and how these outcomes are produced is their problem. So we find, and here I refer to a point that John was making, so we find planning for disability services driven by goals, preferably stated in smart terms, and then which means we talk about time that drive these practices as a constraint rather than as an opportunity. So what the message is from within the approach from people working in the field is that if they want to earn their money and be able to deliver their services, they need outcomes. But how these outcomes are produced is nobody's concerns except the professionals. And there is hardly any assessment procedure in our days that doesn't look at results as outcomes, and that explains why quality measurement is the name of the game in the business of assessment policy. But there is another side of the matter that remains invisible in this way. That is the aspect of quality of life as process rather than as product. The difference is effectively stated by thinking about the good life not as a state of affairs, but as an activity, as a practice. Someone's quality of life as the quality of that person's activity of living. Now, what would the difference between these two things amount to? To see this, we should notice that if the good life as a particular state of affairs, a product of or an outcome, is all that matters, as is currently often believed to be the case, then it apparently doesn't matter what the person herself contributes to the states of affairs. If the outcomes only matters, then who brings it about is not important, and therefore also what the person herself contributes is equally non-important. And that seems to me to be very odd. So what kind of activity, what kind of form of cooperation, what kind of enterprise between people working in the field and a person with disabilities and their families actually make their lives good is on nobody's radar. It's odd because any one of us, we all know the difference our own endeavor makes for the things we enjoy in our lives. So the fact that we ourselves involved is an immensely important factor in making actually our lives good. I want to explore this a bit further by taking one further step in this talk, which is also the last one. The objective goods we enjoy in our life, so the list of things which is well covered in the concept of quality of life as existing of these life domains, these goods that we enjoy in our life, they are not self-sufficient. They are goods, but they are not hyper-goods, to borrow a term by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. It's certainly good to be healthy, but the point of being healthy is what it enables me to do. Ties of affection, social relationships in general, are very important, but they are important for a reason. They are important because of what they enable me to learn about myself. Similar points can be made about any of the goods people mention when asked what makes their life good. The good life, in other words, has a hyper-good, and that is the discovery of who I am and what I'm capable of doing with my life. Put in terms of the earlier conceptualization of quality of life by social scientists, I would argue that personal development, rather than being itself a life domain, is in fact a dimension of all other life domains. It is because of what they contribute to the practices of living my life and living it well that these things are experienced as good in the first place. Understanding the good life as a process, then, as an activity, opens up a wholly different way of looking at it, particularly in connection with impairment and disability. For example, it makes us see that pursuing quality of life is a journey in the particular sense of an open-ended process. Human life, it's in my text as it was in Darla's, is by definition unfinished business, in which the beauty of life emerges from how we respond to what comes our way. And I think here the metaphor of Tom's jazz, the description of Tom's jazz practices was working fabulously, because that is exactly what it is about. It's about responsiveness, it's about creative cooperation. And I think, so let me repeat that sentence again. The beauty of things in our lives emerges from how we respond to what comes our way. And I think that's true for all human beings, whatever the state or condition of their lives, their bodies and minds. Finally, in my introduction to this talk, I said that I was not going to be theologically articulate, and that has been true, but at this point I hope you can see that an argument doesn't necessarily have to be theologically articulate to be theologically true. In view of the previous paragraph, classical theology would say that in embarking upon the journey of living as God's creatures, the beauty of our lives will glorify Him in the way we respond to what He sends our way. And to show what this means, I have to show you what this means, I have a picture that I want you to look at. There she is. For people who cannot see it by themselves, is there anybody who wants to describe what this picture shows? Is there a microphone? Somebody who can do that? Oh, here.
It's a young lady who is in a white wedding gown outside in the forest with some white flowers behind her. She's holding a pink bouquet, bright red hair, and she looks very happy. Is there someone else? Is that what you wanted?
Yeah. And I add one detail, it's a young lady with Down syndrome. I think this is absolutely fabulous picture because you can hardly imagine a young bride looking more happy than she does, and radiant and flourishing. I mean, this is human flourishing. But the absolute magical thing about it, today, as this picture is taken, the young lady is married to herself. Imagine what it takes for the people surrounding her to understand that this was the way to make this young woman flourishing. Nobody has explained to her that you cannot get married to yourself. You need a guy, or a girl. Which, if it would have been told her, it would have again confronted her with the fact that the guy she had been looking for all these years wasn't there. Nobody made that mistake and instead simply thought, what do we do to answer and to respond creatively, as Tom put it, to this woman's dream? This was it. And she got married to herself. This is about human flourishing. Thank you.